Hey guys, Chris here, and I'm a Ukrainian Canadian. Today is November 12th, 2024, and let's get to the news and map updates happening in Ukraine and Russia, shall we? And let's talk about the map updates in Kursk and also a new record for the Russians, 1,950 casualties today alone for the Russian military. It's an all-time high, and I'm expecting to see the numbers increase in the next few days. Why? Because the Russians have started their counteroffensive operation in Kursk. I've mentioned this briefly in my previous video, but the Russians have allocated over 50,000 troops, including North Korean troops, in this counteroffensive operation to retake back Kursk. Putin gave a new deadline, which is January 2025, the end of that month, to retake the entire occupied territory in Kursk, which we know will likely not happen, as Putin has been pushing these deadlines over and over again. But with that also comes huge casualties for the Russians, knowing that they're under pressure, the generals want to get their medals, and they're desperate to be seen as heroes. So they're throwing these men nonstop. And this, as you can see through the arrow, is the road of death that the Russians are taking right now. And they're being obliterated to pieces by Ukrainian defenders. And why I'm mentioning this is because we've received a lot, and we've seen a lot of videos that was shared by the Ukrainian military in the last few days of Russian troops just getting destroyed. Large armored convoys full of BTRs, BMPs, tanks, and also lightly armored vehicles that the Russians are utilizing to storm Novoivanovka. As you can see, this is the village they're trying to take. And they're being met with very fierce Ukrainian resistance right now. And the Ukrainians confirmed that in the past week alone, the Russians have lost 77 armored vehicles, more or less, in this direction alone. In the past week, this is huge, and hundreds of Russian casualties as well. The Ukrainians are running a lot of FPV drones. They're also, of course, using a lot of the modern IFVs, the Bradleys, the CV90s provided by Sweden. There's also the Leopard tanks that the Ukrainians are utilizing here. And of course, the combination of FPV drones and Stuhnas, ATGM systems is really deadly trap that the Ukrainians have set against the Russians, firing from both directions, head first, and just ambushing the Russians left and right. That is not to say, again, I'm not sugarcoating it, that the Ukrainians don't have any losses. The Russians are also running their own FPV drones. They're also flying them. These are the new fiber optic FPV drones that don't have any signal loss because they're being run through an optic fiber line. And, they still are capable of adapting. So the Russians are still inflicting losses to the Ukrainian military here, but it's not as bad as it is for the Russians. And again, we're seeing the same similar scenario as other areas like Bakhmut, where the Ukrainians were able to convert the defense of these, whether it be cities or advantageous terrains, to increase the casualties for the Russians. So sometimes it could be 6-1, 7-1 ratio to the advantage of the Ukrainians. And this is exactly the purpose of Kursk right now, is to just inflict maximum casualties on the Russian military, knowing that they're desperate to retake Kursk, knowing that they will be making a tremendous amount of errors. And with winter coming as well, and I've said it multiple times, that with winter coming, it's going to be far more difficult for the Russians. It doesn't matter if it's in Kursk or in Zaporizhzhia or in Pokrovsk front to be successful. Because of cold weather conditions, they're going to have to take far more open roads. They're not going to be able to just drive through farm fields to get around Ukrainian positions. They're going to have to take hard roads, and that's going to make them detectable. They're not going to be able to be as mobile as during the summer, because they won't be able to use ATVs and scooters and motorcycles and dirt bikes, because, well, if anyone has ridden a motorcycle in the winter, it's pretty terrible. And in the first 5 to 10 minutes, you just don't want to do this anymore. So it's just not conducive for offensive operations. And the winter will really complicate the situation for the Russians. And the Ukrainians do have a sizable force dedicated to Kursk. They will be able to hold it. Yes, Ukraine has lost a certain amount of territory here, but it's all about the ratio of losses that you can inflict on your opponents. And the Ukrainians are doing a really good job. Based on the videos I've been seeing, I'm very confident that the Ukrainians are really just blowing the Russians up here left and right. And this is a huge trap, an effective trap that the Ukrainians have been able to set for the Russians. So Kursk is really playing an important part in this entire war. This wasn't about capturing, so much territory, showcasing the Ukrainian greatness. It was about setting a trap for the Russians so they counterattack. And when they do, their losses would be astronomical, which now, as we're seeing, is the case. So that's the situation for Kursk. The Russians are now dying left and right and expect these casualty numbers to increase to up to 2,000 in the next few days. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case, especially since Russia is now involving North Korean troops in Kursk and even in Donbas. There's some reports indicating that Ukrainian soldiers have already killed some North Korean troops in Donbas as well. So that's the situation with Kursk. Let's talk about Donbas, which is difficult for the Ukrainians. Donbas is really the main push that the Russians are doing right now before the winter sets in. And I've said this briefly in my previous video on the map, that the difficult situation right now is in Kurakhove. The Russians are really aiming to take this city by the end of the month, which could happen in the next few weeks. By the way things are going here, they do have a momentum, and it appears that Kurakhove could be taken by the Russians by the end of this month. And again, there was also a report and a video that was released today of the Russians blowing up a dam in Kurakhove, which will complicate the logistics for the Ukrainians as well. But because I believe that the dam runs like downstream towards Andriivka, if I remember correctly. But again, I'm anticipating that the Russians will be successful in taking Kurakhove in the next few weeks, especially with how hard they're pushing here. They absolutely are disregarding their losses. But again, once the winter sets in and the Russians will be aiming towards Pokrovsk, this will be a much more bloodier battle for them, as they're going to try to take a very large city, close to 80,000 people prior to the war, similar to Bakhmut. And it will take them months, if not even longer, to try to take Pokrovsk, in my opinion, as the Ukrainians are betting on a very hard defense of the city, which will not be a walk in the park for them, for the Russians. Additionally, more south in Zaporizhzhia, there are some concerning reports that the Russians are mounting a huge sizable force. Now, they're already pushing in kind of the northeastern edge of Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk after taking Vuhledar. Vuhledar was here, but a few weeks ago they've taken the city. The Russians have started pushing heavily towards Velika Novosilka, which is more towards the Zaporizhzhia side, as you can see here. So this is Zaporizhzhia, this is Donetsk Oblast, kind of divided here. So they're pushing towards Velika Novosilka, and they're also getting close to the border with Dnipropetrovsk, right? This is another kind of thing the Russians want to do. They want to say that now we're close to Dnipropetrovsk, and look, the Ukrainians are losing this and that, but it's not going to be easy for them, and this is not the end of the world. It's just a small portion of the Dnipropetrovsk area that is currently under threat. But what I want to mention is the Russians are really amassing a huge, sizable force here, according to the Ukrainian soldiers, trying to do another push towards Hulia-Polye, which is another big Ukrainian fortress here in Zaporizhzhia. So the Ukrainians are mentioning that the Russians are accumulating a lot of forces around Tokmak and other nearby cities and settlements to begin a new offensive towards the center of Zaporizhzhia, also pushing the Ukrainian defenses back closer and closer to the city of Zaporizhzhia. It's no easy task. It's not going to be an easy task for the Russians here, because the Ukrainians have been building very large networks of defensive lines here, similar to what we saw the Russians do on their side in Zaporizhzhia as well. So it's not going to be easy for them. And this is why your support, guys, is absolutely necessary here. So if you have any, any money that you want to donate to the Ukrainian military or humanitarian aid, please do so. You guys know that for me, the most effective donation is towards the Ukrainian drone program, which helps save Ukrainian lives. And I will leave a link in the description below to the Sternenko Rusuriz drone fund, which helps the Ukrainian soldiers being equipped with these FPV drones and other recon drones that they need to be able to defeat the occupiers. So that's really important that we continue our support, because the Russians will try to do everything possible right now to make it look like, create this illusion that they have the momentum everywhere and that they're going to just break the will of the Ukrainians. And that's not going to happen. In my opinion, the Ukrainians are going to be able to hold out, because this is a war of attrition, and the Ukrainians at this stage have nothing to lose, right? There is no good scenario where Ukraine goes on the negotiating table being ultimately defeated, militarily speaking, and being on a weaker position than Russia. We understand Russia is not going to be compassionate. They're going to be even more brutal. And if this means that they can't capture the territories that they want to capture today, they'll do it in 2 years, in 3 years, in 5 years, in 10 years, doesn't matter when, but they'll do it because they will feel like they got away with it. So it's really important that we continue our support of Ukraine, and I do believe that Ukraine is going to be able to hold it out in the winter. It's going to be a very difficult winter for Ukraine. Russia is going to continue with its missile barrages, its drone attacks over key Ukrainian cities, Zaporizhzhia, Pavlograd, Dnipro, Kharkiv, of course, Kyiv is one of the most important, and the Russians will try to make it look like they're indestructible. But one thing I've said to you guys many times is their economy. Their economy is going down the drain. It's not a question of if the Russian economy is going to collapse, it's a matter of when. And we've seen in the last few weeks the first signs of the foundation in Russia crumbling. Their economy is going to just explode in 2025, in my opinion. Interest rates are sky high. Inflation is sky high. Russian businesses are going bankrupt left and right. Gazprom, which was the most profitable company in Russia, is now running losses. No more revenues, only pure losses. No more contracts with the West, no more investment from the West. Nobody is going to be working with the Russians in nearby future. Their only lifeline right now is China and Iran and a little bit of North Korea, and if we're talking about the military. That's it. And I think that in 2025, even with the Russian partners and China helping them out, the collapse is not something that the Chinese can stop. The collapse of the Russian economy, their society, is not something that the Iranians and North Koreans can stop. And this will be a potentially very quick process once it starts happening. We'll see, but I'm really betting on the end of 2025 to start seeing really a huge collapse within the Russian society and specifically their economy. I've seen a picture, just to end this video very quickly for you guys, a picture in social media. Now, the Russians are locking butter because people have been stealing butter. They can no longer afford butter. I believe that the price of butter in Russia has increased by like 60% in the past year alone, costing close to 200 rubles now per block of butter. And they're now locking them in these sort of like plastic boxes with security tags because people have been just stealing them left and right. So that really showcases to you how bad the situation is when you have to lock basic staple foods, right? They're going to do this with potatoes and each individual carrot in the future. This could be the reality for Russia. But this really showcases to you guys that not everything is good. And if we're looking globally, Putin is also desperate to bring an end to this war, but he still wants to get away with it by putting maximum amounts of pressure, making it look like the Russian army is strong and, we're going to crush the Ukrainians. It's just not going to happen. And the Ukrainians will hold strong because they know what they're facing. They're facing a Russian military that is not going to be compassionate if they were to win against the Ukrainian people. And what is awaiting the Ukrainian people is a full genocide, because we understand very well that's the plan for the Russians, is to kill, murder, and destroy everything that has an association with Ukraine. So thank you for your support. I hope you guys enjoyed my update on Kursk, on the situation in Donbas, in Zaporizhzhia. The situation is difficult in Ukraine, but the Ukrainians are also able to convert this into positive by inflicting huge casualties onto the Russian military right now in Kursk. And you guys can simply write in Google Russian losses Kursk November, and you'll see plenty of videos showcasing the destruction of their armored convoys. Thank you so much for your support, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Slava Ukraini!